Hey,
Hi, Beth. How are you?
well, it's been a bit, but here you are again.
Yes, here I am, and here you are, or there
I
you
know.
are.
Here, there, and everywhere, right?
Yeah, right.
Wow. Okay. So, do you want to give us this We Defend update?
Or just we keep moving forward, trying to build a donor base, and we keep learning new things and improving what we're documenting in our services and our offering, what we're planning to build, which is good. It's good to run through those things. God's putting us through some challenges that are making this whole thing better. At some point, it would be nice to be through it. But yeah, building the donor base and so doing a lot of networking and calls and reaching out to folks. So any introductions obviously would be great.
Okay. Well, we'll make sure and put the link to This We Defend below.
Appreciate it.
All right. We're in Luke
We are.
11:37 to 15:10.
Yes, we are. It's an interesting area, isn't it? Luke's always bringing out the really important stuff. That's what I loved about him. He's sort of a nerd that way, isn't he? Where it's let's bring up the really important items, but they're put together in such a way that they relate to other stuff. So they're really making a point. So it's good old Luke and good old Jesus, right?
Well, the first thing that I have in chapter 11 is from verse 51. It talks about Zechariah. And I thought to myself, I was like, "Ooh, you know what? I should look up how many times Jesus references." Because I had this, I was looking up other different, what's referenced in the New Testament versus Old. But this is a specific story. And we don't need to go there because we went over it. But Jehoiada, Zechariah's father, protects Joash. And then Joash has his son murdered. I mean, talk about like intrigue and political nonsense of the court. It was crazy. But here's Jesus referencing it, which is sort of like, okay, that must have obviously been a significant one because of the depth of the betrayal. But I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I was wondering why he chose those names, and I did look it up. And what's funny is in English, it's Abel is A and Zechariah is E. I think that's just a coincidence. But Zechariah is the last story in the Book of Chronicles, which was kind of the end of their that chunk of their scripture, that history. And
Yeah.
okay, yeah, so their Old Testament, their scripture was ending in at the end of Chronicles, and Zechariah died at the end of that. Now we do have his book, but that comes up later in our case.
Is
For
that the
that I'm
same
not sure.
Zechariah? Yeah, I'm not sure either. But these are the questions. And you and I have both read the Bible.
So,
Well, no, but here's the thing. You and I have read this quite a few times. And so, but you come back to it and you're like, wait, is that guy? Or is that which Mary?
yeah,
Right? Like, and that's absolutely a genuine question and a sincere
yeah,
thing. And
right.
I don't think even if you've read it a billion times, you can remember it all because it's so convoluted. And I'm not saying don't try or don't get yourself where you're familiar with the scriptures, but I do have to do that. Go, okay, wait, which guy's that?
Yeah. No, that's actually a great practice to ask the questions like, oh wait, is it? Let's make sure not to make an assumption here. I was making an assumption there. That's a good one. I'm not sure, and not sure if I can look it up in real time to see if it was. But definitely a prophet named Zechariah was the
Right.
last one killed
Yeah.
in their timeline.
Well, and this guy was a priest, so maybe, I don't know. I had a good one where I thought the big fisherman was something that Peter was called, and it actually comes from a guy who wrote historical fiction and titled his book The Big Fisherman. But I thought there was a reference to Peter as a big dude, like physically big in stature, and there's not. It was really interesting. Anyway, moving on.
Okay, so key themes. There are a number, but I try to look at. I love looking at the Old Testament and the New Testament. So we have some Old Testament readings in First and Second Samuel, and then they hit in Luke. And it's always amazing that how often there are consistent themes. And I'm sure that you put together the readings in that sort of strategic way, but it's always fascinating how that works out, how there's consistency. So, what I was seeing is what happens when we're faithful, and then what happens when we reject God or screw up, and then our true mission is faithfully using our talents to serve our neighbors. And all those themes are consistent with the characters that are in Samuel. And then here in the messages that Jesus is teaching to in the takedowns he's having of the Pharisees, as well as then the stories he's telling. It's fascinating that those themes are consistent across them both. What happens when we reject God? And sometimes it seems like it's rejecting God, not even completely with the wrong intentions. There's one little story in there, but it was still disobedience. And then our true mission then is faithfully using our talents to serve our neighbors. It's what it really ends up coming down to. Themes in both.
I was a little intrigued in terms of what the word says is if you're faithful, God will be faithful. And yet you have an example in David, because we actually read some of Second Samuel, the end of Second Samuel, which is the end of David's life. And then we're switching back over to First Samuel. And you said, I planned these things. And actually the Lord planned it, because all I did was decide to read backwards because I like to be different sometimes and push against the grain.
It's new.
Well, what's funny to me about this, and we will get there, is something that I haven't really talked about on the podcast before, but 3 years ago, I started writing a copy of the Bible. And my intent originally was just to do Torah. And like I said, I haven't talked about it here yet. Thought about it. I almost did it. And then literally the section that we were reading in Samuel had Psalm 18 that David quotes. And that day, so this was a couple days ago, but a couple days ago, I was actually writing Psalm 18, which the Lord knew 3 years ago. And only God can do that kind of stuff where you go, what? And how many, whether I took a day off and I was sick, or how fast I would go randomly. It's just so crazy to me. So no, I didn't pick these two passages to match together. God did, because I decided to read backwards and then changed up the plan, dropping the second reading of Psalms, etc. Here we are. And only God can do stuff like that. And I just absolutely love it. So that's a theme for me, is that David is always considered a man after God's own heart. He's touted for this. And yet this is a guy who committed adultery, who murdered someone, and then he incites God and does a census. And this is the epitome of who we're supposed to emulate, but it has to do with his heart condition. Just like when Samuel calls him, he's looked at, it's like first brother passes second brother. And these are big, strapping, beautiful men, warriors, and all this jazz. It's like, no, 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 no. 7 times till the eighth. Well, have you got any other sons? And then
Well,
Jesse's like,
I
well,
got the
yeah,
youngest. Yeah,
the one out back, right, with the sheep.
yeah, yeah.
And so to me, that's just the beauty of the situation, in terms of the fact that God looks at our heart, and David's heart, in spite of all this stuff, in spite of all of it, was amazing. So that's kind of, for me, the overarching theme isn't just because it's not about God desires obedience more than sacrifice, which is what he tells Saul when we get there, but he's about your heart and where your heart is centered, and is your heart out for God. And that's an entirely different thing than your behaviors.
Right. Yeah. Well, and Jesus is ripping on the Pharisees, because at the very beginning of our passage today, and it's kind of funny, but he gives them the dressing down, and it's because of that. It's, you're clean on the outside, but you're dead on the inside. If you are causing other people, in your desire to be all legalistic and appear like you're holy, you're actually leading other people astray and making them unclean, because that's what it was. If you walk on another grave, you are considered unclean. And they were creating all these rules, and it was rules for thee and not for me. So they usually wrote in nice little loopholes for them to get out of stuff, getting out of, being able to follow the rules. And Jesus called them out. It's like, this is just dumb. If your kid fell in a well on the Sabbath, wouldn't you reach down to get him? Of course you would,
Of
but you
course.
would
Yeah.
say that that was illegal. So why is it so bad for me to heal somebody?
I do have a note here that is a random, silly thing, and you're not going to have an answer, and I don't have an answer. But in the beginning of 12, verse 1, and this is again the same thing. You and I've read this. You still catch things that you've never read before. And NRSV 12:1. Meanwhile, when the crowd gathered in thousands, so that they trampled on one another, he began to speak first. And I'm like, wait, trampling crowds? that's a big deal. Like, that's sensational. Like, wait a minute. What happened? Like, it's just this random, the crowds were trampled. What? Like,
Yeah,
that's
it
kind
just
of a,
happened.
yeah, it just happened and we're moving on and now we're talking in parables. And it never says anything else. And yet later on, he does talk about the tower that fell, which is current events, essentially. And usually there's very, very little of that in the Bible. And yet he does mention that. And but it's so funny to me because I had never seen, it's not that I've read this verse before, but I thought, trampled people, what? And then there's no details.
Yeah, like it's just what they do. They didn't wait in queue like good Brits do. They didn't look for the. It's like, no, I got to get in. Got to get on
Yes,
the train.
that is absolutely, yes, it's a real thing. It's a sport. And the British are very, very good at it.
First of all, we had a little technical glitch there, and while that was happening, finished looking up the Zechariah thing. Different Zechariahs. So the last Zechariah, the Zechariah Jesus was referencing as in the Abel to Zechariah, was a priest that you mentioned before that was stoned to death. The prophet Zechariah came later,
Well, and
apparently.
that's the parable of the vineyard and the master of the vineyard who goes away and then he sends servant after servant who they murder. And then finally he says he'll send his son, which is the
Yeah,
picture of Jesus.
yeah.
I
And
do
then they
have
murder
another
him.
little note here in 1254-56. I just thought it was sort of a little season reference because it says, "You know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time?" And to me, it's very, very clear Jesus kept his word. And again, we don't all have to agree. I know you and I aren't necessarily on the same page on that, and that's all good. It's not part of salvation, but it's an interesting one for me because I was like, "Ooh, that's a little
It's a
season verse."
mystery.
This is very true. That's a good word. That's the word that the Bible uses.
So that passage in 54 to 56, there was a cool note in the commentary I was looking at that. Uh, that's another one of those you just are so blind kind of moments. So it's a bit more of a smackdown than you realize when you just look at it. It's like you can see even then that if the weather is coming, if the breeze is flowing from the west, you're going to get rain because it's coming off the Mediterranean. If it's from the south, it's coming off the desert. It's gonna be hot. You can see that obvious stuff, but when the cultural winds are blowing, you're blind to it, or you just refuse to acknowledge it, even though it's super easy to see. And I'll bet you could probably come with a couple examples from today where there's some cultural winds blowing, and there's a lot of people who are lost in the church that are willfully ignoring the words of Christ. And what's happening then to the church in the West? It's kind of falling apart.
Absolutely. Well, and we think of ourselves as having freedoms, and we do in quotation marks. However, look at the Chinese church. The Chinese church, they're exploding all over the place. There's so many secret believers. They memorize entire books of scripture. And we sit in a Bible bookstore paging through 10 different copies and yet haven't really read it most of the time. It is just sort of
Yeah.
weird.
Yeah, it's amazing how much stronger the church is when it's being persecuted. So right now it's kind of persecuting in itself. And there are some indications of some revival or at least some change in how people are thinking, with especially Gen Z men really coming back to the church and actually favoring traditional churches, even whether you like it or not. That a lot of Catholic churches are, they're going there, or they're going to more traditional Protestant churches as opposed to the more quote unquote modern churches, because they see the stability of the teaching and the preaching and the history of the more traditional churches. And that's young Gen Z men in particular are going there, and it's a positive sign. At least it's a positive indicator. There's a trend there, but will it stick? We'll see.
Yeah.
But so they're seeing the wind, right? And realizing they don't like it. The wind's blowing from the south. That's hot. So we could use a little rain. So that's what they're going for.
Yeah, I before we move over to the Old Testament, the only other 2 notes I had were in Luke 14. Again, we've said this, but verses 1 to 7, Jesus is pointing out their hypocrisy. And I can't remember which verse it's actually in, but there's a point at where one of and whichever version I was reading at the time said lawyer instead of scribes, which sometimes throws me. I think that's helpful occasionally to be disrupted in that way. But regardless, it was also like, wait, what? Oh, yeah, scribes. Okay. But it said, "You know, teacher, you're insulting us too." And he just keeps going. Jesus just doesn't even halt. He just, yeah, like, he doesn't even acknowledge that. He doesn't even say, "Oh, yes, I'm insulting you too." He just says, "Woe to you," and really dresses them down in a significant way. And it's funny to me that the guy points out, it's like, "No, do you know what you're doing? Do you know you're being like this?" And Christ doesn't even consider it. Yep, like, just moves right on and continues insulting them, which is really funny because if we
Oh, yeah.
skip over to verse 11, 14:11, "For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And this is the first shall be last, and the last shall be first." And so we so often, especially with little kids, right? They're lining up and they're jostling to who's going to be first. And it's such a upside down, inward, backward from a kingdom of Christ taking the humiliating action to wash his disciples' feet.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a stunning picture that he paints there when he gets down and washes their feet. It's servant leadership, and that's what he's demonstrating. But that section there with it's the ESV that has the lawyers. That's what I was reading first, and then the NIV has teachers of the law, and they were sort of like the uber Pharisees, right? So he was kind of ripping on the Pharisees, but then they were the most legalistic. They were the ones that were writing stuff, and he was the one. So yeah, I think it was the six woes. Woe to you for this. Woe to you for that. Woe to you. If they had stayed quiet, that might not have ever come out. But they said, "Well, what about us? Look at how good we are." And he's like, "No, you're the worst."
Yeah.
It's like sometimes you don't want to call attention to yourself.
Right? Maybe just stay quiet. Yes. I
Yeah.
have
No,
a problem
it's
with
fine.
that sometimes.
Yeah. Don't we all? Something, a little bit of humor there. If you look at chapter 12, verse 3, he says, "Therefore, whatever you have said in the dark shall be heard in the light, and what you've whispered in private rooms shall be proclaimed to the housetops." So is that a foreshadowing of the modern surveillance state?
Ooh, I like that. Well, and our phones, our screens, Tyler has a really good video on that. I'll try and see if I can link it. I think I have linked it before, but he talks about the silicon sand and makes a connection to the evil one and what he's doing. It's an interesting theory. I definitely kind of go, ooh, yeah. So,
Right. So, all
all
right.
right.
Well, why don't we jump into Samuel? And then there's some back and forth here, obviously, in the messages, so we can hit those.
Well, I wanted to highlight it's 2 Samuel 22, which is
Mhm.
essentially Psalm 18. And it was so weird because I read it, recorded it, and then went, what? Okay. I mean, obviously, I've heard some of this before, but and I got out, I like sat there and looked at it, and I thought, you know what? This is what I've just, and I got my notebook out, notebook 7, because it's obviously in my handwriting in terms of my copy of the Bible. And I just kept going. I was originally, it all came from Kings, obviously. I get stuck in Kings, and it was a king had been, one version said that a copy of the book of the law was written in the presence of the king, and another version said the king wrote a copy of the law, meaning Torah, meaning Old Testament, meaning those first 5 books. And I thought, that's so different. That's so much more significant that he would have to write it himself versus he's sitting there as he's watching someone write, which is weird. I thought, okay, I'm not a king, but this would be a good thing because I've read this book, I've heard this book, but happy writing, like literally sticking it into yourself by writing through each different word. And it was literally Psalm 18 that I was at. But that's the significance of 2 Samuel 22 for me, is that it is Psalm 18.
Yeah, and that is interesting, and that's David remembering God's grace, right? It's a cool psalm, but it go then then it goes to what what was God's promise to us, and then he goes into hope, but it's going through his pain of failure as well, in a very short period of time there in Second Samuel. So David, a man after God's own heart, then fell, yet God still used him. That should be an encouragement to all of us as well, especially those of us named David. That that you can, not like you should be encouraged to fail, but you're going to fail because you're human, and that doesn't mean you can no longer be used. And the devil's going to whisper in your ear, "You screwed that up," and so you can't. Who are you to keep going? And it's like, no, no, I'm doing the right thing, and I acknowledge that I'm not perfect. So I'm going to keep trying to be better, and I'm going to put people in my life to hold me accountable. For instance, once God's going to put you through, and this is one of the themes that seems to show up, is God puts you through significant tests and significant trials and hardship to make you a better person. So was David a wiser person at the end of his life after all of his screw ups? Yeah, he was. I mean, he also reaped the consequences of his actions, like his kingdom fell apart, but there was positive that came out of it. And at least for a while, Solomon did a pretty good job, and then kind of not so much. But still,
Those
despite
foreign
his,
wives, they'll lead you astray.
I know, seriously, but despite his failings, God used him. Uriah, who he had killed, was one of his mighty men,
Well, that's
one of
where
his
we are.
30.
We're here on the Mighty Men in 23.
You read those names of the mighty men, and there's the three, right? And then there's the others. And Joab was one guy who was kind of on the bubble there. He wanted to be one of the three, but he couldn't get there. But he helped out. He helped David out early on, especially. But he also said, no, we probably shouldn't be doing this. Like when David wanted to go do the census, and it was a Joab was like, no, we shouldn't be doing this. And David said, we got to do it. And he's okay, we'll do it. But he did it reluctantly. But he's like, I can only argue so much.
Well,
But he knew it
maybe
was
maybe
wrong.
definitely Joab is one of my favorites. And I do have a couple notes here on in 23:20. Benaniah, the son of Jehoiada, was a valiant warrior from Kabzeel, a doer of great deeds. And it goes on to tell you all the things that Benaniah does. Benaniah is the one that kills Joab on the altar for Solomon. When David at the end of his life says to him, don't let Joab go down to the grave and with gray hair. And Joab is David's nephew. And again, there's all these cries of, oh, these sons of Zeruiah. And he's literally saying, like, my nephews are jerks. It's so funny to me because all you hear is the Bible expression of you sons of Zeruiah. And yet he literally is saying, like, my nephews are jerks. Like, I can't even control them. He does get stuck with the fact that there's three of them. Obviously, Asahel is killed, but they are a force to be reckoned with. So Uriah carries his own death sentence in his letter that goes to Joab because Joab is the army commander. And David tells him in this letter to do this. And Joab does it obeying, right? And yet Joab, and one of the things that I find so fascinating about Joab isn't somebody that you go, oh, this is a Bible character I want to emulate. Not so
No,
much. But he's not just a Bible baddie. He does things like tell David, wait a minute, what are you want to count? Are you what? No, 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 no. Let's not do this. And he even says, may the Lord your God multiply the people, but don't count them. And in the rebellion of Absalom, he goes in there and tells David, stop it. You have just made every warrior who has protected your kingdom feel horrible today because you're bemoaning the fact that your son who just had a rebellion. And it is so he does some things that are good, but Joab's sin is he will not forgive Abner for killing Asahel. And then Amasa, who is his other cousin, because Amasa becomes the commander of the army after this whole thing with Absalom. And again, what was going on there? What's the intrigue in the kingdom or in the palace behind all of these things and these relationships that were much more complicated than we're led to believe? You just sort of hear, oh, okay, there's this guy called Joab. Well, actually, it's David's nephew. It's his flesh and blood. And so much of this is lost when you just read the words and you don't connect all the pieces up. And yet there's
yeah.
so much here.
Well, I think about the mindset of a guy like Joab. What kind of person was he?
Well, in First Samuel, so we're at Hannah and Samuel's existence, and Hannah is
Hmm.
obviously quite a character in terms of the Old Testament and so faithful and sacrificial, having given up everything essentially, has this child that she has longed for. And I love here in First Samuel 1:6, her rival used to provoke her severely to irritate her. Like, can you be more of a jerk? You have all these kids, she doesn't have any. But the reason is because the husband loves Hannah, not Penaniah. It's
Yeah.
jealousy.
Yeah, it makes you
And
wonder about the whole polygamy thing, doesn't it?
it's a little weird. You have women, David's mother, right? She had 8 sons and 2 daughters at least. This is an individual woman. I actually met someone the other day here in Colorado, and he said he had this many kids, and I was like, wait, did your wife give birth to all those? And he said, absolutely. It's like, wow, okay, so why do we have Rachel and Leah? Why do we have Penaniah and Hannah? It's just a bizarre one. Just like in the New Testament, you've got slavery. Yeah, his slave. Wait, what? Like, that's not good. Where did that come from? But yet, that existed in that world. And so it's talked about, but it's also not preached against as such. Like, Paul's not saying, hey, it's good that we have slaves, but he's saying there are slaves. And so, therefore, there is a behavior here. If you are a slave, you can still glorify Christ even in
Right.
your slavery.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can also treat your slaves well. So that's one of those problems when you don't look at historical documents in context.
Yeah.
They were moving the needle radically on things like slavery, on things like
Yeah.
respect for women. Women are smart and capable, and they were running households and things.
Hmm.
But there were still significant cultural differences back then. So slavery was so normal, and sometimes they weren't. It was like you won a war, and sometimes they were just people that owed you money, and so they worked it off as opposed, So there was different
Yeah. Types of slaves. Yeah.
actual statuses of slavery.
Yeah, you could
Most of
get
them
out
could
of slavery
you
if you
could get out
just
of
yeah.
it, and you didn't necessarily have a stigma on you. You got out of it next. So different, but it was moving the needle significantly when talking about you slave, you have to act this way, but the slave owner, you have to treat your slaves well. You have
Yeah.
to love them.
Yeah.
That's weird. That's it's a major difference. And then Jesus' ministry and the Acts where they had women as leaders in the church and financing Paul's ministry. And so it was like, that was different. That was
Well, and
unheard of.
Jesus reveals himself to the Samaritan woman by himself alone talking to her. Like, and she is the first person he tells that he's the Messiah. So
Yeah. Yeah, it's really cool. It's really cool seeing that. And when you see that and you understand the history and the context of what's happening in all of these stories, it makes a big difference. And oh, wait,
absolutely.
no, that's not so bad. They were really pushing the needle.
Yeah. I have to give here in First Samuel, it's 2:12. Now the sons of Eli were scoundrels. And I have to give a shout out to my friend Jen, who her dad helped her memorize different bits and things. And it talked about, she said to remember the HP sauce that you want to put on your food. It's a British thing. I guess it's a British theme today. But and so there was Hophni and Phinehas, and one day we're at Bible study, all of us, and she's like, "Yeah, the HP sauce," and the rest of us are looking at each other like, "What the heck are you talking about, Jen?" And she's like, "That's how you remember the names Hophni and Phinehas." Okay, all right, girl, which I love. There are little memory tricks for all of that kind of stuff, and I absolutely love that. And then I thought in the story of Hannah, I did want to know. And so I looked up Ramah, where Hannah lived, and Shiloh, where she left Samuel, is 15 miles. It is a day's journey or a 6 to 10 hour walk, obviously, depending upon how fast you walk and what's going on there. So basically,
And
her
whether you
kid's
got get robbed on the way.
yes, well, exactly. Her kid's a long way away from her, and she leaves him weaned. So how old is he? Really little.
So, but what's funny is, so you have Samuel who, have these sons that aren't that great.
Right.
And
And
it's
that,
like you have these leaders, and it's like, why are their kids so bad?
yeah,
And it basically was probably the straw that broke the camel's back on Israel then turning and asking for a king. And so it was partly Samuel's fault, even though, God says, don't take this as a rejection of you, it's a rejection of me. But in some ways,
yeah,
he and Eli both had a lot to do with it because
yeah.
people that were sick of their scoundrel children.
Well,
Thing
but
is,
a
the
king
thing is,
doesn't
they
get
got
you any
kings
better.
who were worse,
Yeah,
which was like,
right.
how
Yep.
would you think a king's children would be any better than a priest's
Yeah.
children?
Well, and the king's going to take your sons and daughters for his service. Lord has Samuel tell him that specifically. So I wanted to make a note here on 4:21. This is Eli's daughter-in-law giving birth and names her child Ichabod. which is the glory is departed from Israel. And then you move over to 7:2, and it says, from the day the ark was lodged at Kiriath Jearim, a long time past. So the ark goes to the Philistines get it. And of course, Dagon falling on his face, the god Dagon in the Philistine camp, falling on its face in front of the ark is God's sense of humor of like, nobody's there. Just all of a sudden the idol's laying on its face in front of the ark, which, you got to know that God was like, whatever, dudes.
Yeah.
But it is sort of an interesting thread as you go. And then it says in the second half of 2, a long time passed, some 20 years, and the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. And it's like, why didn't you go get it? If the ark came to Kiriath Jearim, then, and they get in trouble because the townspeople before that look in it, and then nothing good happens. And this is where the Ark of the Covenant is a symbol, but God sits in the cherubim above it, not in the box. And so they wanted to see what was in the box. So one of the things that I find funny, which is kind of ironic that I was talking about writing the Bible today, is 1 Samuel 13. If there is a mistake, in big quotation marks, italics, bold, in the Bible, it's here in 1 Samuel 13. Basically, whoever was the scribe, and I did a bunch of research on this, and even whoever, Dead Sea Scrolls, the whole 9 yards, it says Saul was blank years old. And it's like they meant to go back and fill it in later and they didn't. And some versions smooth this out and sort of say, or they pick up an inference from somewhere else because it doesn't actually say, and it's not very clear how old Saul was when he began to reign, but it's just sort of funny. And he reigned for blank and 2 years over Israel. And it can happen to anybody. And like I said, it's not wrong. It's just missing. The information is missing, but it's missing on purpose. And God decided that was going to stay. I find that kind of comforting in a weird sort of way.
That is weird though.
Yeah.
They had that blank. So there's one question I have. You look at the arc of the story of Saul and then the arc of the story of David. I'm sure there's reasons here, they're God's reasons, but Saul was a good guy at first. He did good. And he was trying to follow God and he did what he was told to do. And then a little bit of pride hit him and he made a mistake and then and he got angry at that and then he started getting angry at everybody and especially David. But then
Well, I want to mention something good. He defends the men of Jabesh Gilead, that rescues the town, and the dread fell on everybody because he sacrifices these oxen and said, "This is what's going to happen if you don't come out and rescue these people." And he really does rescue them. Does a good
yeah,
job.
he does. No, he's amazing king to start with, and really 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 good. And so it looks like first a good choice was made, and then the human side comes out and he starts to really fail. But similarly, David has this same arc of very very good, lots of good stuff, and then he starts to make mistakes. He has some pride and but on the Saul side, God allows essentially an evil spirit to influence him heavily, and on David that doesn't happen, and David repents, and yes, he realizes the results, the impact of his his behavior, the results of his behavior, but he ends up living a long life, not being really deposed. His son takes over as king and all that, and all that. But it's so weird that why the different arcs? What was different about the two, where both of them do great, they both make mistakes, but then one falls apart and the other one doesn't. And why? What was so special about David? And I think maybe
But
understanding that would probably be a
isn't
good
the
lesson for us.
answer the heart condition? And we don't know that. You can read these words on a page, and we didn't meet him. We didn't talk to him. We don't have any inference as to how he was as a human, but it always talks about David's heart being after God. And Saul starts out that way
Mhm.
when faced with, and this is 1 Samuel 15, what is then the bleating of sheep in my ears? And that's Samuel. And so Saul's trying to get all good. Instead, when David is approached by Nathaniel saying, sheep, you stole a sheep, he tells the story. And then David goes, I am that man. Or sorry. Nathan says to David, you are that man. And David goes, oh, okay. And he doesn't
Yeah, you're right.
try to cover it. It is an interesting question. And I, one of the things that you said kind of in a good way ruffles my feathers, because you're like, well, if theologians can't figure it out, I don't need a theologian. And I don't mean that disrespectfully. There are plenty of people that do have a lot of learning about the Bible, but this book has access to me as a little old human, like just as me. Like, I have no qualifications. I haven't gone to Bible school. I haven't done anything. And I specifically, I told Pastor Larry when he came, because he was my pastor for many years, because he retired. I was like, all right, I'm letting you in because you retired, but you have officially studied, whereas the rest of us haven't. And yet this book allows us access to understanding God better. And
Like, okay,
I don't think,
good point. Yeah, yeah. So you're right. It's a heart condition. And how did David react, even though he made very human mistakes? How did he react to that when he was actually called out on it?
yeah,
So yeah,
which, I think
Saul disobeyed,
what
and
you're,
then he tried to hide it, and David disobeyed.
yeah,
Now Nathaniel came in and called him on the carpet. David didn't offer his mistake, but when it was called out, he acknowledged it and repented,
yeah,
whereas
yeah.
Saul didn't. Saul was like,
Well, and
"Why?
I,
Why was such a big deal?"
yeah.
That was
No big
Saul's
deal,
reaction.
no big deal. And then when he's pressed is when he gets that. And I think it's interesting because it's in 1 Samuel 17, the very end of the reading. It says, and the women sang to one another as they made merry. Saul has killed his thousands, David his tens of thousands. Saul was very angry, for this saying displeased him. And right there, instead of saying, oh my gosh, look at a mighty warrior that serves me, he is like, well, why are they celebrating David? Why is David better than I am? Like, that's his instantaneous reaction, is not this heart condition. But I think what your question about, like, well, why? This doesn't make sense. And yet I think that that's, if you look at the surface of the happenings that go on, I think it's a legitimate good question. It's like, okay, well, why did it go down like this? If this guy did this and that guy did that, what's the difference? And yet I do think that you can, if you look under the hood a little bit, find this thread of David's heart. But it's a hard thing to
Yeah, and
find.
that's a great point. So when you said the David has killed his 10,000s, and when they're introducing David's mighty men in the passages here, they talk about their exploits, not in great detail, but certain exploits. Like, this was just one thing. And
Right.
like, one of the guys killed 800 men in one day in a war.
Yeah. Yeah.
And David wasn't bitter about that. He's like, yeah, that's my guy. So there's a difference there, where David's more of a
Yeah.
servant leader, and it's like, no, my guys are great, and they're my guys. So they reflect on me, and so I'm good with that. So he didn't see them as competition, at least for a while. So there's a difference. So good point.
Anyway, on
I
that
stand
note,
corrected.
oh, no, no. It's all good. But iron sharpens iron. This is the whole point of us talking about it, wrestling with it, looking at the text and trying to figure it out. And I don't think I have all the answers in any way, shape, or form, but I have found so many nuggets, and I've been so blessed as I've recorded myself reading this, where you think, oh, I didn't remember this was an okay. All right. I got something here. So Jonathan thing with his honey, I really like that, because Jonathan is so faithful to David.
I
And
love
yet,
Jonathan and their relationship. In one of the versions, I think it's ESV, it talks about how their souls were connected.
right.
It was a deep brotherly love that they had,
Yeah.
and it was amazing to have it worded the way it was. How it was just so tight.
Yeah.
You know, you love to have friends like that. In Luke, just a real quick thing, and this just kind of gets into some modern discussion, kind of segueing from, from all this discussion about war and and all these people conquering, days when kings go to war. But in Luke 12:49-53, it's talking about peace. The way it's talked about, and especially in the modern church, especially certain parts of the church, they don't want to have any conflict. In Luke 12:49-53, it says, "No, I bring conflict. I came to cast fire in the earth, and that it would and would that it were already kindled. I have a baptism to be baptized with, and how great is my distress until it is accomplished. Do you think that I have come to give peace on earth? No, I tell you, but rather division." And we have this is going back to the conversation earlier about the Western church and why it's weak and just it's falling apart because there is no truth anymore. We're not willing, so many people are not willing to take on the fact that some things are wrong
Yep.
and certain
Well
behaviors,
said.
certain lifestyles, certain things are wrong. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't love people,
Right.
but we should not then enable the behavior to continue. We should be calling it out. Yes, if you try to say that judge not lest you be judged, which is taken out of context all the time. No, we are called in this passage to judge what is right and wrong based on what is, in the law. Yes, in other passages we're called to love our brothers and sisters as well, but that doesn't mean that love is you're sinning, just keep doing it. So we can
Yeah.
always, then you can try to redefine what sin is. But I find it really interesting that he says, "No, I did not come here to bring peace. I'm sowing division. The word of God is a sword, right? It's not pudding. I'm not throwing pudding at you. I'm throwing sharp metal at you. Is what it is.
Right. Well, and I see those verses as well eschatologically. Even so, he's kind of prophesying about himself and his return. I
Yeah,
mean, he's saying came, so it's here now. But that's where what we talked about with the Pharisees. It's like, well, do you know you're insulting us? He's like, let's go. Let's go. This is serious. This is absolutely and unequivocally serious in what we'll talk about with David in the heart condition.
yeah. And so had David and Saul understood this concept, if you go on down a few verses, and why do you not judge for yourselves what is right? What this is right after talking about the winds and being able to understand and the breezes and understand what's right and wrong. So that's the next sentence is why do you not judge for yourselves what is right? Had David and Saul taken that to heart, and because they knew they had the voice in their head, and we all have that voice in our head. That's not right. I'm gonna do it anyway. So they did the same thing, and they had the power, unfortunately, of kings to be able
Hmm.
to do those things, and they had the loyalty of people that, while Joab would call him out briefly, he's gonna
I was
obey.
just about to say we're back to Joab, which is where we
Yeah,
started.
yeah. So nice full circle. It was an unintentional bookend, but it worked out.
Segways for the win.
That's right.
All right. Well, maybe we can get you back again, Dave.
Absolutely. Love it.
All right.
Thanks, Beth.
Thanks.